Hello, Jeando.
Hello, Kevin.
In the last few videos, we've been talking about what is wrong, what is right, how do you know the difference? So how does this play out in a lesson of conscious guidance and control? So when you have a pupil, how do you teach them what is wrong, what is right, and then how do they learn for themselves to know what's wrong, what's right, and what to do about it?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. We always need to find a way to implement the principles into our activity. And my activity is, of course, teaching. So it's interesting to see how I translate what Alexander is saying into the teaching situation and how a lesson is constructed. I make no mystery to my students and pupils on how how we are to construct lessons, because in the end, in the whole purpose of the training is to enable the person to continue teaching herself without the teacher being there. So it's better if you know how to construct a lesson, if you are to give a lesson to yourself, or very simply, you are receiving a lesson from a teacher and then you're on your own for a week or two. What do you do with it? It's always interesting to understand how the lesson has been constructed, because how you do with it depends on what you understand of the lesson. Why there were these procedures, these gestures that the teacher asked me to perform. Why did we perform this gesture in that way? What were we trying to achieve? And so I thought that this time I was going to start very strictly with this idea. And it connects with something that Alexander insisted upon, is what the concept of continued orders. It's a technique where there are verbal orders. We give ourselves verbal orders, or we give our students verbal orders, and we want to see how the person is going to translate these orders into action. Basically, this is what we train people to be capable of doing. That is, giving themselves more than one order at a time, and of course, direct all these activities together. All these orders simultaneously are creating what we call a coordination of movements. So the movements have to be directed. The movements, very curiously, have to be carried out. The person must learn to carry out movements, but not isolated movements. You don't want to be able to carry a movement with your head or a movement with your tail. No, you want to carry movement that involves the head and tail at the same time, with a very precise geometric goal in mind. So the orders have to be directed, the orders have to be carried out, and the orders have to be continued. So very often, this is a question I receive from my students when they discover that Alexander in different books is talking about continued orders. What do we mean by continued orders? So I thought that it was a good time to start discussing the psychological or organizational aspect of the mental practice that we teach. So let's start with, just a recap, a reminder. And apparently this is not working. I can't see my screen, so I'm going to stop share. Sorry for that. You'll have to edit. It's not working. Let's see. Now it does, but it's not at the proper shape. That's it. Shall we start again? So the pupil is having a lesson with me. So most of the time, well, 99% of the time, it's a long distance lesson. So that means that each of us is in his own country and in front of his computer. And well, I am sitting, and the pupil may be sitting, standing, walking. He may be doing a different kind of things. But I am going to request the pupil to perform a gesture. Like, for example, I would say something like, let's start that lesson by sitting down. This is a sort of stimulus that the pupil is receiving during a lesson. And so the pupil will more or less understand what I'm talking about and perform a gesture that we call sitting down. So we understand that the pupil for that has to certainly look for a seat, look for a chair, then maybe make a few steps to reach the chair with the back of his knees, and then perform a gesture that we call sitting down. The gesture of sitting down involves many different movements. There are, of course, movements at the knees, movement at the ankle, and the hips, and there are movement of the whole torso. Even the arms may be involved, maybe too much. And there is finally the movement of the head in space. So we have a starting point, because I will see how the pupil, for example, in the gesture of sitting, like in the gesture of walking, you have something that Alexander calls leaning forward. So the person is going to lean forward in order to sit, and this is going to be recorded on screen. Then from there, we are going to investigate and analyze what have been the different movements that have been involved in, for example, leaning forward. And when I asked the student why, for example, he did move the pelvis, the tail, if you want, that I call the lower sacrum spot. Why did he move the lower sacrum spot away from the thigh? It's a question, for example. And the pupil will, first of all, be, well, stopped in his track, because he's not very aware of what is done with that part of his anatomical structure. It's not something we are trying to, evaluate very easily. But on screen, it's very obvious after a few explanations that yes, every time the pupil is leaning forward, the pupil is moving the tail, the lower sacrum spot, in a direction that is opposite to the leaning. And when we inquire into what is the guidance of that particular part of the movements in general, so it's a movement that is part of the general movement of the act of sitting. And Alexander gives us an explanation. He says that the pupil is in fact guided by his feeling sense. If he has received somatic lessons, modern Alexander technique lesson, where he's supposed to be helped by the hands of a teacher to lean and to bend, it's absolutely accepted that is guided by sensory guidance. But it's supposed that he's been re-educated, or that his sensory appreciation has been re-educated, and so therefore it should be good. But we still can inquire as to the necessity and the correctness of pulling the lower sacrum or pulling the tail in the opposite direction to the head. So everybody knows that the head should go forward. Nobody really think about the tail going back and what the effect could be. So the first thing is that Alexander explains that the pupil is guided by his sensory appreciation, and this is exactly the case in every one of my lessons. So this is for me like a principle that has never been disproved. So that's where I'm starting. So that's it. The pupil is performing every series of acts according to his feeling sense. This is called the habit of gaining. This habit of gaining is so ingrained sometimes it's so ingrained because it has been reinforced by somatic lesson. But even when it's not the case, I've got some pupils that never had a lesson of the Alexander technique before meeting me. Well, despite this, we see that the modern Alexander technique is just reinforcing something that is already very, very strong. This habit of engaining is so ingrained that it will create a serious difficulty, even where the teaching methods is based on the means whereby principle. And the difficulty can be overcome only if both teachers and pupil at every step in their combined procedures, even the simplest, adhere strictly to the working principle I have set down, namely that in a series of acts which have been thought out as the means whereby a given end can be satisfactorily gained, the primary act must not be considered as an end in itself, but must be directed and carried out and then continued as the preliminary means of carrying out the secondary act, and so on. Well, this principle, this working principle is guiding every one of my lessons. So I will explain how I explain to myself and how I represent what Alexander is talking about here. So there is this idea that we have to think out, to in fact reason out, if you want, a series of acts where, and these series of acts are going to be the means whereby a given end can be satisfactorily gained. So very often people misunderstand that what we are talking about when we are discussing the primary act or a series of acts. So I thought it was interesting to make it clear. And for that, I've taken an example. So I just saw a picture on a website. And I read the comment, and the comment was very, very good, talking about ease in action, talking about fantastic poise and inhibition. And I was surprised. Well, here we have a picture of a teacher and a student. It's in a training course, and this, I think, correspond exactly to what Alexander is talking about. A series of acts are being seen, and they are not seen directly. This is the difficulty. What we see is only the position. It's a still image, of course. We just see that there are two people that are apparently involved in some sort of re-education training. One is acting as a pupil, and the other one is placing his hand on the neck and head and superior part of the torso. But I'm more interested for the moment in the person that is playing the role of the teacher. I don't know that person, but what I can see is a number of defects, as pointed out by Alexander. I've shown just a few. Well, what is obvious at first is the shortened back. There is the protruding abdomen, the retracted shoulder blades. There is the shoulders that are really tight and really high. The person, in order to perform this action, is lifting the shoulder very high. You see bulging muscle at the back of the neck. We see the straight neck shape. And so that person has been involved in a procedure. The procedure is called the lunge. That is, the person is leaning forward while making a step. It's not a complex procedure. It's a very common procedure in the world of the Alexander technique. But this person is performing that procedure, but I think his attention is more directed to what he's doing to the pupil than what he's doing to himself. And so I suspect that that person is directed by his sensory appreciation. This is engaining for me, because what is missing is the conscious, reasoned directive orders. Anybody who has trained with the initial Alexander technique that I teach, myself, for example, if for a second I start a procedure under supervision of a camera, that is, if I start performing a gesture while I'm recorded to make a control of what is happening, if I do not think out and reason out the movement that altogether will produce, of course, the lengthening of the mechanism of the torso, we will see the different defects that Alexander calls interfering with the mechanism of the torso. So we see here that there must have been, what we see is the result, but what we don't see and we must imagine is, of course, that particular individual must have perform a series of movements with the upper torso and the shoulders, with the middle torso, and with the lower torso. So we have the definition that Alexander called shortening the spine. When then a series of unconsidered acts lead to an interference, what we mean, what Alexander's mean, he means a shortening of the spine. So when Alexander produces an illustration in, it's called, the chapter is called Illustration in the second book, Constructive Conscious Control of the Individual. This illustration is about hands on the back of a chair. And by the way, when you'll see the picture in bigger angle, you will see that the teacher is preparing the pupil to put her hands on the back of a chair. So, hands on the back of a chair is a procedure. But before starting the description of the procedure itself, Alexander makes various definitions of the most important thing in a procedure of the Alexander technique. And by far, the first and most important thing is what he defined as shortening the spine and lengthening the spine. Regarding shortening the spine, you say an objector might justly say that this is practically impossible. But we are dealing with the use of the spine. And one of the most common defects among human beings today is an undue curving of the spine in the use of the self in the acts of everyday life. And naturally, this causes a shortening in stature. Well, if you wondered what is a shortening of in stature, here you've got two examples. Yeah. And there is a tendency to curve. And you will see that this is exactly how he defines his shortening. He says, as a practical demonstration, take a piece of paper, and after placing it flat on another sheet, draw a line along the extremes ends of the top piece, thereby recording the length by the pencil marks on the paper underneath. Now lift the top piece and curve it slightly and replace it with one end touching one line and without interfering with the curve. It will then be seen that the other end of the paper does not reach the other line. With a human being, it's exactly the same thing. So we start to see that the direction of the tail is also quite important, because in order to obtain the shortened shape that you see here, you are simply curving a line. And so to curve a line, well, it's not difficult to imagine that 3 acts are applied at the same time. There is, of course, the torso, the middle torso that is directed forward, protruding the abdomen, yeah, very markedly. But there must be also 2 other opposition of movement, that is the upper torso and the shoulders, as well as the tail, the lower sacrum, are pulled back. So it's easy for me to explain to the pupil how I see the picture. And because it's a film and not a still picture as this image, I can show when and how the movements are coordinated together. What is the proportion of movements? Yes, sometimes, for example, there will be nearly no direction forward of the middle torso. The middle torso is going to stay exactly in place, and it's just the tail and top that are going to be pulled back to shorten the stature and protrude the abdomen, and all the, well, activities are going to translate into that completely stiffened neck and the retraction of the head and all this that comes with it. So when we have a lesson, it's always, in fact, directed toward this capacity of that we want the pupil to develop, that is to first understand. Well, when we say direct movements, what we mean is conceive movement in one's head, conceive that, yes, the shortening of the back is not something that happens, that it's not some sort of condition that the pupil is affected with. I have a straight back, or I have a very arched lumbar curve. No, this is not a condition in the sense that something that is independent of the capacity of movements of the pupil. It's just that the pupil is not used to directing different movements, a series, a number, if you want. To make a series, you need a number of movement at the same time, all together. The pupil is not aware. But on this picture, for example, when we look at it, the series of acts that lead to the shortening of the back can be clearly, well, demonstrated to the pupil, so that the pupil can suddenly realize that there are defects in the movements that is allowing to happen when he leans forward. So the goal is to lean forward without the shortening of the back. That's quite a simple way to describe any lesson that I give. So there is this idea that the pupil can start ordering new movements using verbal instructions. We've seen that the middle torso has gone, of course, forward, opposed to the movement of the tail and the movement of the top of the torso. And so the plan is to question this condition. And by questioning, we say, could it be possible to direct the middle torso backwards? But not backwards in isolation, because that doesn't mean anything. We mean backward relatively to the movement of the upper and lower torso. So at first, you may start with just opposing 2 movements. But very, very quickly, very soon, the pupil is going to discover that if you want to lengthen the back when leaning forward, it's the procedure that we are discussing at the moment, the pupil will have to think about more than 2 movements from the start. And from the start, the pupil will have to reason out how he can command these movements, and reason out also what could be the effect of directing the movement in the opposite direction to what his sensory appreciation is commanding. Of course, when the pupil, so we've seen the pupil bending, well, we need some sort of reeducation, because when the pupil is performing this, it's because it feels correct. The sensory appreciation commands these movements, and what the person understands of it, or is that the person is embodied. The person, in fact, has a mental activity that accept and support this kind of coordination of movements. The teacher comes from outside and say, well, when I look at it, I see that you're shortening the spine. But the pupil, when doing it, has no idea that he's doing so. His idea is that he's expanding, is correctly performing his action, because he knows that he's going to transmit to the pupil most of his mistakes, if he does do mistake. So to regain normal health and power in such cases, what I call reeducation is absolutely imperative. What we mean by that is that the person must suddenly discover that what he feels, or what he's been made to think that is release, is expansion, is lightness, in fact is not. The video recording is going to show that, well, the person is shortening the back. There is no question about it. Protruding the abdomen in this way cannot lead to correct functioning. You cannot breathe properly in this way. It's easily demonstrable. So reeducation means that instead of being directed by what he feels, or being made to believe that what he feels can be reeducated, which for me is more or less the same, it's absolutely imperative that he understand the power of reasoning and the power of the word to command movements. So, of course, instruction, this treatment, Alexander at the time, it was the first book, he was not so regarding, and he could use the word treatment. So the reeducation is a treatment. It begins in practically all cases by instructions in the primary factors connected with the eradication of erroneous preconceived ideas, connected with bad habits, and the simplest correct mental and physical coordination. So the primary factor connected with the eradication of erroneous preconceived idea is this idea that we cannot do anything about our coordination, that these movements are reflex, that the person has, I don't know, a bad back, or that the person is hunched from birth. That's for us the total misunderstanding of the coordination of movements. And so the first thing is to empower the pupil to understand that he can, in fact, start to direct movements. He can start to use verbal instruction to, in fact, think different movements at the same time. At first, most people are very afraid of the word coordination when they discover that we mean it. That we mean that, yes, we want different movements to happen at the same time, coordinating. That is ordinated, ordered, or commanded at the same time. And so, well, of course, we are going to start with the correct mental and physical coordination. That is a coordination where it's the mental realization that leads the movement, that leads the physical. We are not delving into how it must feel, how it should feel. Anything like this is completely out of question, because this is the somatic tale. This is making people believe that because they have felt a certain organization of the head and neck, everything should be right, when obviously it is not. So there are displaced parts of the body, and they must be restored to their proper position by reeducation in a correct and controlled use of the muscular mechanism. Well, what that means is that the displaced parts of the torso, Alexander used the body most of the time for well, as a synonym for the torso, and the displaced parts of the torso must be restored to their proper position by reeducation of the pupil. It's the onus is on the pupil to change the coordination of the different movements. And you will see that when Alexander explained hands on the back of the chair procedure, what is very, very interesting is that each step of the procedure is geared and controlled by its effect on the mechanism of the torso. At every chapter, every part of that chapter, Alexander starts to, well, explain that the pupil is going to shorten the torso, that the pupil is going to interfere. So when the pupil is starting to lean in this illustration, the pupil is requested to sit according to the principles set forth in the first book. And the principles set forth in the fourth book are how to expand the mechanism of the torso in every act. So the pupil is requested to sit, expanding the torso. And the pupil may fail, so that the teacher must start again from scratch and ask the pupil to rehearse his orders. And that's where the big, well, equivocation comes in, is that most people think that the orders not to shorten the torso is to decide to, well, release the neck, let the head go forward and up, and let the back lengthen and widen. Well, the teacher that you see on this picture must have rehearsed these sentences, well, I don't know, 1,000 times, 10,000 times. And we see the effects. So for me, I started to be disappointed because the orders, the solution, neck free, head forward and up, back to lengthen and widen, did not meet the educational goal. Nobody that repeated these orders were seen to lengthen the torso while doing the simplest act. So I started to think that it was possible to take the problem from the start and start to think of these directive orders that have to be continued, that has to be performed. And I say, well, if the performance is about having the middle torso go forward and the upper torso back and the tail backward to shorten the back, well, it's not that complex to imagine which direction of movements could lead to a lengthening of the back. And I started from this. And with this, I said, well, we are discussing the anatomical structure, position. We are not discussing the muscles because the muscles are way too complex. So let's start with this time I take the same picture, but I want to show you what's happening with the student. So this is the student, and you may note that the student has already bent the knees and moved the tail back. There must have been a first step where the student must have been fully erect. And this should be, or looks like, something that the teacher and student consider to be a monkey phase, a leaning forward with the torso. But what is interesting on this image, what I want to show, is that, in fact, we can analyze this image and we can see that there are different movements that are applied to the structure. And so the teacher is helping, and the teacher is creating a direction forward for the upper torso. The upper torso cannot go back because the hand of the teacher is strictly directed forward. So we have the upper torso that is directed forward. And so I place a green arrow at the top. I see that the top of the torso is going forward. Something that I note is that the middle torso is not going forward. Yes, when you are directed forward, the idea would be that the whole rib cage would rotate forward. So if it's not rotating forward, the pupil, because I see no hands, I don't think the teacher's hand is on the middle torso of the student. It may be, but I don't think so. But anyway, whether it is the teacher that is asking the student to direct the middle torso back, or it's the student herself that is directing the middle torso back, there must be a direction backward, because otherwise we would see the upper torso and middle torso moving forward. The only part that is fixed, or pretended that is fixed, is, of course, the foot. We know where the foot are, and all this image is organized with a grid that is starting from the front of the ankle, as always when I analyze pictures. So we have the upper torso and middle torso that are organized. But what is interesting is that as the pupil has bent the knees so that we see that the hips have gone back, the pupil is not with extended legs, so the hips are back in space. We see that in the movement of, well, having the hips go back in space, a movement that is necessary to go into monkey, we see that the pupil has pulled the tail upward and backward. As a result of that movement, and I would say coordinated with the two other movements that we are seeing, the pupil is greatly shortening the back. So for me, this is a picture of misuse. This should be the starting point of the lesson. I should investigate to see whether, when the pupil is going into monkey, when the pupil is pulling the hips back, or the movement is happening at the hips, we would like to see what is happening and whether the tail is going in the opposite direction, which in the same direction, sorry. The hip is moving back and the tail is moving back as well. It's as if when the pupil wants to pull the hips back, the pupil, without maybe knowing it, because the end-gaining act, this is an end-gaining act. This is the person is performing something consciously, but there is, well, some part of the movement that is not directed consciously. Therefore, it's directed by the sensory appreciation, the feeling. The person is feeling that this is the response to give. And so the tail is moving back when the hip is moving back. The question that we are going to ask, of course, is would it be possible when the hips are moving back, when they have to move back, would it be possible not to start and accelerate the movement with the tail? Could it be possible to, in fact, maintain the direction of the lower sacrum forward so that we have the upper part of the torso directed forward, as requested? We have the middle part directed backward, and the lower part directed forward, which would mean a lengthening of the back. So we cannot, of course, separate the movement at the lower torso from the movement at the top and middle torso, unless we use only reasoning, unless we start to work in our mind. It's possible to isolate the part, to look at it, to look how it's constructed, what is the mechanism we are dealing with. Maybe it's impossible not to go back with the tail when you move the hips back. Who knows? You know, you don't see what's happening inside. So maybe there is no other way than to arch the back when somebody is going into monkey. Well, of course, we have seen pictures of Alexander or the first generation teacher that were able to go into monkey, that is to move the hips back relatively to the knees without their bum sticking out and up. So something is telling us that it should be possible. But there is something that is happening, that every time I suspect the teacher or pupil are going into monkey or leaning forward with the torso, we see the same picture. You see the teacher is doing exactly the same movement with the middle and lower torso combined. So we suspect that there is something that is going on here. I wanted to show something. It's Alexander speaking about what he called stereotype position. Lengthening the back is not a stereotype position. Lengthening the back for us is a certain coordination of movements. So he said, I emphasize this last because no one stereotype position can be correct for each and every pupil. When the person so employs the different part of his body that one can speak of his harmful position in standing or walking, it is only by causing the physical machinery gradually to resume correct and harmonious working, thus changing the position from time to time, that serious harm can be averted and satisfactory results secured. Again, this can be totally misconstrued if you don't know that Alexander considered that there is a position for the torso in walking. There is a position of the torso in going downstairs, as there is a position of the torso in leaning forward. So when I look at both student and teacher in these pictures, for me, this is exactly what Alexander is talking about. These people are employing the different parts of the body, different parts, I would say, of the torso, so that one can speak of his harmful position or her harmful position in going into monkey, in standing, or in leaning. We do not consider that the movement at, well, the lower torso is a position. Because, of course, when you go into monkey, you have to change the movement, the relative position of the leg, of the pelvis, and of the lower spine. So now that this is said, well, yes, we can come back to this observation and start to realize what are the factors that are active or the ones that are not sufficiently active to produce this, well, shortened back by having, well, the middle torso and the lower torso organized, the movement of these parts organized in this way. So I've taken this image from the net so that you can see what we are discussing. There is the bone of the thigh, the femur bone. The femur bone is articulated with the pelvis. The pelvis has a quite a strict and restrictive connection with the lumbar spine. So we see the lower sacrum, and we see that I've traced a line. And on this picture, I would say that once again, we see that in standing, the tendency of that person is to have the tail directed backward every time the hip is slightly further back. So I consider that the knee should be further forward than the hip. So we are in the condition where the hip is moved back. And so the person is leading with the tail. So this is, well, it's not surprising because most representation most anatomical representation are, well, more or less copycats of this. So at first you think, well, maybe this is the human form. Maybe this is natural. Well, there are some people that maintain that lengthening the lumbar region by having, as Alexander said, direct contact of all the backward protuberance of the spine against the wall is unnatural. I do not think in that way because I know that the spine can bend both ways. You can arch the back forward, but you can also arch the back backward. And you collapsing the top, you can easily, in fact, flex. There are two possibilities. You can extend. This is an extension. And there is another possibility is to bend the spine in the other direction, which would be a flexion. So when we discuss lengthening the lumbar spine, what we discuss is the medial movement where you're not bending either forward or backward with the center of the lumbar region. So on this picture, there is something I wanted you to see. It's there is the representation of a pear-shaped muscle. Pear-shaped. In the old days, pear was piri and form is formis. So we have the piriformis. The piriformis is a muscle. Well, the depiction is not really accurate because there is it's all red. Well, it shouldn't be, because you understand that that muscle is like any other muscle. It's got tendons that attach the muscle to the bones. Apparently here it's depicted like if the muscle was attached directly to the bone, so it's not possible. But also we don't see the enormous amount of elastic structures that are in fact working with that muscle. But still, it's quite interesting to know that there is the piriformis muscle. I wanted something simple because, in fact, if you look at, you will see that the piriformis is only one of the muscle that can have an action on the lower spine, on the tail. Yes, but all these muscles that are situated between the tail and the leg bone are creating an action that is not really represented most of the time, you know, because in anatomical books, these muscles like the piriformis or the gemellus, that are the ones that were presented before, are in fact muscles that are presented as acting on the leg. When the person is standing quiet, or when the person is going into monkey, you do not rotate the leg mostly. What you do is rotate the torso. So you must understand that that muscle acts as much on the leg that it acts on the tail. So we are going to be very interested in the action of that muscle on the tail, or its failure to act on the tail. Because, of course, you can see that if that muscle suddenly releases, well, its function is to pull the tail toward the bone of the thigh. But if it releases, it goes back. The tail will have a tendency to rotate backward. Yeah, and this will increase the shortening of the back. So we must suspect that when the person is moving the knees forward and the hips back, which is the case on this picture, the person is releasing this group of muscles. And as a result, there is no direction of movement on the lower sacrum, apart from going back and upward and shortening the back. So the question to the person is, do you think it's possible for you to change the direction of movement of the tail when the hips and maybe the middle torso are going back in space? It's impossible to answer without making an experiment. But if an experiment was to be made, then we would see a new picture. So we have the habitual way. And when there is an habitual way that is incorrect and we need a reeducation, then the pupil needs to have some ways to organize our mind. So I will start explaining to her that it's possible to represent what is the shape of the movement on the mechanism. And for her to, in fact, direct our mind toward the movements of the mechanism, it's necessary to start having anchors for the mind. And so you can see I've placed spots on the different bony parts. So there is one spot on the very front of the anatomical structure of the pelvis. It's the antero-superior iliac crest, so we call that iliac. And there is the lower sacrum spot. And I will ask the person to physically locate these spots. And I will ask the person to describe what is the direction of movements of this spot when the person is going back with the hips, yes, and forward with the knees. And the person will have to really, well, instead of feeling something, really describe verbally what is the actual direction of the movements of the parts. It's only when the person understands that we are dealing with the anatomical structure position before and after the gesture that it's possible for the person to change our way of organizing the movements of the different parts. So what it is we don't want to see, well, the middle torso collapse forward. We don't want to see the protruding abdomen. Let's say we start with this. Do you like the protruding abdomen when you do the monkey? I'm not doing the protruding abdomen. Well, on screen you are. Okay, on screen I am. I don't feel I'm doing that. Yes, you don't feel you're doing that, but on screen it's seen that you are doing it. Yes, but if I don't feel I'm doing it, I'm not doing it. Yes, it's a certain way of speaking, but despite the fact that you don't feel that you're doing it, we are seeing you do it. So from an objective point of view, not from the somatic first person experience, but from an objective point of view, there is a movement that is happening. And as you are the only person governing the movement of the pelvis when you go into monkey, well, it's something you're doing. So the question is, could you do otherwise? Could you start to organize the movement of the lower torso as well as organizing the movement of the upper torso? Question. So in that case, there could be a possibility, and the possibility could be described as direction of movements. We could say that the movement of the middle torso back, let's say we want the back to go back, back, should be, in fact, concomitant, organized with the movement of the anterior-superior iliac crest, of the iliac, not forward and down toward the front of the knee, but backward. And I would ask the pupil, do you understand that we are discussing a rotation of an object? And can you place the center of rotation of that object? Because depending on where the center of rotation of that object is, we can maybe infer which should be the direction of the iliac spot when we are rotating in the opposite way. Instead of having the tail go back and up, well, we want the tail to go forward toward the knee. So when the hip is going back, we want the tail to go forward. Do you think it's possible to shorten the horizontal distance between the lower sacrum and the front of the thigh? We don't know. It has to be performed. And so when we perform that movement, suddenly something is changing. What is changing is that, of course, the spine where all the weight of the torso is applied onto the pelvis is not forward, it's backward. And we have a particular shape for the pelvis, a fulcrum. Suddenly the spine is not on the supporting bone anymore. There is a moment of forces here. So the whole weight is acting at the back. Therefore, there are different things that are going on. The first thing is that there will be a tendency for the lower sacrum to continue moving forward toward the side, continue on its own, just because of the geometry of the fulcrum. When you observe that type of mechanism and you apply a very heavy load on the back, you must understand that you're promoting a constant rotation. So why is it not collapsing backward? Well, it's not collapsing backward because I have drawn here an enormous, well, myofascial structure, which is myo is muscle, the red part is muscle, and the blue part that is surrounding it is fascia with the very enormous tendon at the front, and all that attached to the interior part of the bone of the leg. And you see that the more you apply pressure on the back of the pelvis, the more you're going to stretch that system. So you're using, in fact, a spring and a lever mechanism that is going to maintain the torso erect without any effort. So we see something that we call antagonistic pull in activity. So this is, well, theory for the moment. But look at this picture. I was interested in looking at it because the whole shape is interesting. There is the first thing is a very immense extension of the leg. We see that this walk is powered by the in leg, and we see that he's just reaching the floor with the front leg. But while the thigh is directed backward, I'm looking at the tail of Alexander, because this is Alexander on the beach. And when I look at the tail, suddenly I realize that, yes, the movement of the middle torso is opposed to the movement of the tail. It's opposed to the movement of the hip. It's even possible to have the tail very far forward when the leg, remember that, of course, the bone of the leg is attached to the lower sacrum. And what we see is that when Alexander is making a step powered by the in leg, well, his lower sacrum is not directed backward. It's obviously directed forward. And so suddenly we get this continued action. So we see that the movement of the bone of the leg, be it backward in, well, the extension, or forward, preparing the step, we see that the back is maintained exactly in the same position as for standing. So there is a position for standing and a position of the torso for walking, and obviously it's continued, it's the same. So the continued orders are orders that you have to continue, and orders that can be continued to obtain the same support, the same base for the torso. So the primary act, the act of base, is not to be considered as an end in itself, but it must be carried out, directed and carried out, and then continued as the preliminary means of carrying out the secondary act, and so on. So the base of the torso is obviously, for me, this part, and it's possible to teach how to organize the movements of the different parts so as to maintain this primary act of support of the torso. I hope it makes sense.
Yeah, it's excellent. I haven't heard any explanation of that picture of Alexander from anyone like that before. I like the way when he mentions mental and physical coordination. So the lesson begins, or he says the treatment begins includes the simplest, correct mental and physical coordination. The wording is very action and movement oriented, whereas nowadays that people would use for this would maybe say mind and body relationship, which is already very different. It's more kind of abstract, but it's more based on feeling. So when people think mind-body relationship, they're thinking about the feeling of they're aware of the sensations or the feelings. Whereas what he's talking about is mental and physical coordination is about the action of multiple mental objects coordinated together, multiple physical movements coordinated together, and then those two, the mind part, the mental part and the physical part coordinated together. It's just very different.
It's totally different, I would say.
How it kind of became later mind-body relationship. Yeah.
It's totally different. And it's absolutely obvious that we are discussing at the moment directing movements with the mind, with instructions. We don't care what the pupil is feeling. If we see that the back is shortening, the back is shortening. You can feel you are perfectly supported. If we see that you have a protruding abdomen and that you're pulling the tail backward, well, you are, and you are not lengthening. And no matter how many feelings you have and how good you feel when you're doing your shortening. For us, it's a shortening. And the solution is the means whereby principle. The means whereby principle means that you have to understand which movements coordinated together lead to the position that you see. And it's also the means whereby principle, this idea that it's possible for human beings to learn to use verbal instruction to combine opposite movements, antagonistic movements, as we call it. And so this is the basis of our lessons. I've read recently some comments by, I think it's Robin John Simmons. He's a teacher of primal experience, moving like a lizard or something like this. And he's also an Alexander teacher. And he said, this torso man, Alexander construed as the man that was obsessed with the mechanism of the torso. This torso man is a misguided ideas as FM was concerned in psychophysical integration of the whole organism and pointed out continuously that it was wrong to think of the body in terms of bits and pieces. Well, I want to know where Alexander continuously pointed out that it was wrong to think of the body in terms of bits and pieces. When you does not part mean bits and pieces? The direction or the use of the parts is that not what we discuss here? So I do think of the body as parts and pieces. And it's absolutely necessary to understand the bits and pieces in order to be able to direct the movement correctly. And directing the movement correctly has nothing to do with feeling like a fish or lizard or trying to follow a crazy idea of developmental thing, the DART procedures. No, it's very, very clear that the pupil need to understand how she can take control of her movements, take control over coordination. So it's, I think what we teach is totally different from Robin John Simmons' technique. It's completely, well, the opposite, simply.
And Alexander seems to be talking more about it's the relationship between the whole and the parts. So you can't just, it's not just that like everyone's kind of flipped it the other way because everything was too based on parts only in the culture, the way people saw it. So they just flipped to just the whole. But you can't do that either. It's I mean, this is a philosophical debate that goes back thousands of years. What's the relationship between whole and the parts? Okay, thanks, Jeando. For people listening, watching the video, you'll get a link underneath for Jeando's website if you want to book a lesson with him. And we'll see you in the next one. Thanks, Jeando.
Thanks, Kevin. Bye.